Well, the third principle of Phariseeism is what I call irrational interpretation. The rabbis don't call it that. They call it midrashic interpretation. This is sometimes translated into English as homiletical or hermeneutical interpretation. And what it does is it systematically ignores the language and context of Scripture. And the principle behind this method of interpretation, or this approach, is that Scripture is a divine code. And only the rabbis have the knowledge and authority and tools to decipher that divine code. And we've already seen an example of that with the words, "It is not in heaven," from Deuteronomy 30. The rabbis took only those words, "It is not in heaven," out of the context, disembodied them from the context, and imbued them with the meaning that was never intended, that God has no authority in how to interpret Scripture. Now let's look at another example, a classic example of midrashic interpretation, or rational interpretation. Exodus 23, verse 2. There we read in the Torah, "You shall not go after the majority to do evil, neither shall you testify in a matter of strife to incline after the majority to pervert justice." And what this means is that you must not follow what the majority says just because the majority says it. You must follow the truth, even if you're the only one doing that. And if you're testifying in a court case, you must not say that a certain person is guilty just because everybody says he's guilty. You must testify the truth, even if you're the lone voice of reason, because to do otherwise would be a perversion of justice. Now, this is a very, very important commandment in the Torah, that we must follow the truth, and not the majority, not to be sheeple, follow after the herd. But the rabbis take this verse, and of course they have the absolute authority on earth to interpret Scripture, and using this authority, Scripture being a divine code, they arbitrarily take off words from the beginning and words from the end, and what they're left with is the principle, incline after the majority. And in fact, this is a very important principle in Phariseeism. When there was this debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, why was it so important for Rabbi Eliezer to convince the other rabbis that he was right? Why couldn't he just say, "I'm a very wise man, you're very wise men, let's agree to disagree"? Why did he have to invoke miracles and have God calling out from heaven? Why couldn't they just agree to disagree? Because the rabbis said to Rabbi Eliezer that you must incline after the majority. They said to him in Exodus 23:2, "It has already been written that you must incline after the majority. We're the majority, you have to accept our opinion." That's why it was so important for him to convince them. If he can't convince them, he has to accept this opinion that he knows to be factually untrue. Now, what's wrong with this? Who's to say Scripture's not a divine code? That's what the rabbis would respond. They'd say, okay, we're taking these words out of context, but that's the original intent that God had when he gave the Torah. Who's to say Scripture's not a divine code? Well, I know Scripture's not a divine code because it tells us in Deuteronomy exactly how to interpret Scripture. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 12, it describes there a commandment that the Torah must be read out loud in a public reading, and there we're told, "Gather the nation, the men, the women, the children, and the sojourner in your gate, in order that they hear, and in order that they learn, and fear Jehovah your God, and diligently do all the words of this Torah." And the purpose of this public reading every seventh year of the entire Torah, from Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy, is so that Israelites would hear the Torah. By hearing the Torah, they would learn the Torah, and by learning the Torah, they would know to do the Torah. Now, it goes on in verse 13, and it explains, "And their children who did not know," that 7-year-old boy who's never heard the Torah before, it's his first time, "their children who do not know, they shall hear and learn to fear Jehovah your God." Now, this is very important, because what this means is that the way the ancient Israelites learned Torah was by hearing it. And actually, this is the way that God intended that the Torah be understood. By coming every 7th year and hearing it in the public reading, someone who's never heard Torah before, someone who does not know, will simply learn it by hearing it. Now, once we realize that you can't take 5 words out of context, "It is not in heaven," because when I'm hearing it, I'm hearing the entire passage. I'm hearing the entire verse. I can't take 2 verses here and 3 words there and a half a verse here and proof text myself into an entire theology. I have to actually read Scripture within its context and look at all the evidence and all the context, not just taking a few words here and a few words there. Because that's what the ancient Israelites would have understood and heard when they heard the Torah read out loud every 7th year. Now, why is it that they had to hear the Torah? Why couldn't they simply sit in their houses and read Torah like we do today? Why did they have to actually hear it out loud and come all the way to Jerusalem every 7th year? Well, the reason for that is that the average ancient Israelite did not have a copy of the Torah in his house. It took great wealth and resources to have a copy of the Torah in your house. And in fact, there's a specific law in Deuteronomy 17 that the Messiah anointed king of Israel must write for himself a copy of the Torah. And the reason he must write for himself a copy of the Torah is that if he doesn't write for himself a copy of the Torah, he won't have one. He can't go to the store and buy one for $3. If he doesn't write it out letter for letter, word for word, he simply won't have one. And if he doesn't have one, he can't reign as a righteous king. As a righteous king of Israel, he has to have the Torah at his side at all times. And that's why Deuteronomy 17 is a specific law commanding the king to write a copy of the Torah. Now, again, did it take such great resources to make a copy of the Torah? Let's remember, in ancient times, if I wanted a copy of the Torah, I had to start off with an entire flock of sheep that I could slaughter in order to make parchment. Not everybody could afford to do this. I had to have barrels and barrels of ink in order to actually write the Torah. And bear in mind, you couldn't go in ancient times to Office Depot and say, I need 30 barrels of ink. You had to actually have someone go out and produce the ink and produce the barrels. This was a whole industry just to write one book. And finally, maybe the most expensive part is you had to have a scribe sit for at least a year and sit and copy letter for letter, word for word, in order to have a copy of the Torah for yourself. So the average Israelite simply did not have a copy of the Torah. He didn't have the wealth or the resources to produce a copy of the Torah. And the Creator knew this, and that's why he took into account and said that the way the average Israelites will learn Torah, the simple shepherd and farmer, is by simply hearing it every seventh year. Now, once we realize this, we realize that the way Scripture is intended to be understood is by looking at the language and the context. And that's key to understanding the correct interpretation of Scripture, looking at the language and the context. Now, this is actually a big challenge for us. We can't just show up every seventh year and hear it because we have certain challenges the ancient Israelites did not have. First challenge we have is a linguistic challenge, the language. The Torah is not written in King James English. It's actually written in Biblical Hebrew. Now, the problem is that nobody today in the world speaks Biblical Hebrew. I've lived in Israel for 12 years and I'm fluent in modern Hebrew, and I actually read Biblical Hebrew fluently, but nobody speaks Biblical Hebrew as their native tongue. Now, to give you an idea of what the difference is, it's like the difference between the English you speak here today and the English of Chaucer.